War is often remembered through the clash of armies, the thunder of artillery, the movement of tanks, the advance and retreat of front lines drawn across maps. But in the East, beginning in the summer of 1941, another kind of war unfolded far from those shifting battlefields. It crept into villages at dawn, entered cities without warning, and turned ordinary streets into places of silent terror. This was not a war fought only against soldiers. It was a campaign directed at civilians, a systematic effort to break societies from within, to eliminate those deemed undesirable, and to rule through fear so absolute that resistance would seem unthinkable. Behind the columns of advancing German troops came something far more insidious than military occupation, a structure of repression designed not simply to control territory, but to reshape it through violence. In the southern Soviet city of Krasnodar, that structure would reveal its full and brutal purpose. The invasion begins. In the early hours of Sunday, June 22, 1941, German forces launched their invasion of the Soviet Union, shattering the uneasy partnership that had existed since the joint defeat of Poland less than 2 years earlier. The offensive, known as Operation Barbarossa, was unprecedented in both scale and ambition. Yet from the very beginning, it carried with it intentions that reached far beyond military victory. As German units advanced eastward, the war they brought was not confined to combat against the Red Army. Entire segments of the civilian population were marked as enemies. Jews, communist officials, former Soviet soldiers, political activists, and anyone suspected of aiding resistance movements were targeted for arrest or execution. Violence followed the front lines, often arriving only days after German troops secured an area. Civilians were detained in large numbers, interrogated, and frequently killed without trial. Executions took many forms: shootings carried out in fields or forests, hangings staged in public squares, and later, killings conducted inside specially adapted vehicles that would become known as gas vans. To enforce these policies, German security forces relied not only on their own personnel, but also on local collaborators, individuals who knew the population intimately, who could identify neighbors by name, and who, for reasons ranging from ideology to fear, agreed to assist in the persecution of their own communities. The fall of Krasnodar. By the summer of 1942, German forces had pushed deep into southern regions of the Soviet Union, aiming to seize the oil-rich territories of the Caucasus and secure strategic supply routes. On August 12, 1942, the city of Krasnodar fell under German control. Even before its capture, the city's population had been reduced significantly by evacuation efforts and the strains of war. Those who remained now faced a new and far more immediate danger. Krasnodar came under the authority of the German 17th Army, a formation within the Wehrmacht, supported by SS units and the Gestapo, the regime's secret police responsible for surveillance, arrests, and executions. Soviet civil administration was swiftly dismantled and replaced by an occupation regime grounded in racial ideology and collective punishment. Control was maintained through intimidation and violence. German security forces began arresting civilians almost immediately. Jews were identified, registered, and detained, often with the assistance of local collaborators who could single them out from among the population. Communist Party members, former Red Army personnel, and individuals suspected of sympathy toward partisan groups were also seized. Others were arrested following denunciations by neighbors or acquaintances, accusations that could be motivated by personal grievances as much as political loyalty. In most cases, the outcome was the same. Arrest rarely meant imprisonment alone. It meant torture, deportation, or death. Machinery of death. Central to the campaign of terror in Krasnodar was Einsatzgruppe D, one of several German mobile killing units tasked with eliminating perceived enemies behind the front lines. Operating in conjunction with it was Sonderkommando 10A, active throughout the city and surrounding districts. These units conducted executions openly and repeatedly. Killings were often carried out in daylight, sometimes within sight of passing traffic or residential neighborhoods. The visibility of these actions was deliberate, intended to demonstrate German authority and discourage any thought of resistance among the civilian population. Detainees were marched under guard to execution sites outside the city limits. Ravines, anti-tank ditches, and hastily dug pits became places of mass killing. There, prisoners were ordered to remove their clothing and stand at the edge before being shot from behind. Many fell into the pits wounded but still alive. Soil was then shoveled over the bodies, burying the dead and the dying together. Those who survived the initial gunfire often suffocated beneath the earth. Entire families were killed in this manner, including pregnant women and young children. Mercy played no role. Execution as warning hanging served as another method of repression. Gallows were erected in prominent locations across Krasnodar, and the bodies of executed individuals were left suspended for extended periods as warnings to the living. Placards were sometimes placed around the victims' necks, labeling them as partisans or traitors. These spectacles were meant not only to punish, but to terrorize, to send a clear message that defiance, whether real or imagined, would bring swift and public consequences. Gas vans, killing in motion. Among the most notorious tools used in Eastern Europe were mobile gas vans. Outwardly, these vehicles resembled standard transport trucks. Internally, however, they had been modified to serve as instruments of mass murder. Victims were forced into sealed cargo compartments, after which the doors were locked. Engine exhaust was then redirected inside the vehicle as it drove toward burial sites. By the time the vans reached their destination, those confined within were either dead or dying from carbon monoxide poisoning. In Krasnodar, gas vans were used in a number of documented killings. Soviet post-war investigations reported that hospital patients, including children, were among those killed in this manner. The city marked by death. During the months of German occupation, an estimated 7,000 civilians were murdered in Krasnodar and its surrounding areas. The killings were systematic, carried out as part of a broader strategy of domination and control. When the Red Army retook the city in February 1943, mass graves were uncovered and survivors came forward with testimony. What had taken place during the occupation could no longer be concealed. The dead had been buried, but the truth had not. Stalingrad's shadow. The German surrender at Stalingrad on February 2, 1943 did more than end a battle. It shattered the illusion of inevitable victory that had followed the Wehrmacht across Eastern Europe. As the Red Army began to push westward, reclaiming ground that had once seemed permanently lost, German occupation authorities understood that time was no longer on their side. In Krasnodar, this realization did not bring restraint. It brought acceleration. Executions increased during the retreat, as occupation authorities sought to prevent prisoners from falling into Soviet hands. Witness testimony later claimed that the Gestapo headquarters was set ablaze with detainees still locked inside during the retreat. The goal was simple: destroy the evidence before Soviet forces arrived. Mass graves were hastily concealed, documents were burned, local collaborators were ordered to exhume bodies and incinerate the remains in an attempt to erase the physical traces of murder. But the scale of what had happened could not be so easily hidden. When German control began to collapse, survivors began to speak. The return of the Red Army. On February 12, 1943, Soviet forces retook Krasnodar. Investigators entering the city soon uncovered burial sites containing hundreds of corpses. Despite German attempts at concealment, medical examinations revealed signs consistent with carbon monoxide poisoning. Findings later linked to the reported use of gas vans. Witness testimony confirmed what the forensic evidence suggested. Survivors described not only the vans themselves, but also the executions carried out beyond the city limits, and the role played by local collaborators who had guarded prisoners, escorted victims to killing sites, and in some cases taken part directly in the deaths of civilians. Taken together, the material evidence and personal accounts formed a consistent picture. This had not been random brutality, but an organized system of mass murder carried out with chilling regularity. The Soviet authorities resolved that punishment would follow. Preparing the tribunal, plans were made to convene a military tribunal to prosecute crimes committed in the Krasnodar region. The proceedings, held between July 14 and July 17, 1943, before the Tribunal of the North Caucasus Front, were prepared under the supervision of the highest levels of Soviet leadership, including Joseph Stalin himself. The trial was conducted with the appearance of formal legality, though its outcome had effectively been determined in advance. Much of the evidence presented during the hearings had already been collected in earlier investigations. Defendants and witnesses largely repeated statements already given during earlier investigations. Those brought before the court were not German officers but Soviet citizens, ethnic Russians from rural backgrounds. Most were between 25 and 34 years old. Several had belonged to the Communist Party or the Komsomol, the Soviet youth organization, before the war began. They now stood accused of treason. 4 faced charges for specific acts committed during the occupation. The remaining 7 were prosecuted for their alleged collaboration with German security units, including Sonderkommando 10A. Their involvement had included arresting suspected partisans and underground fighters, guarding detainees, transporting prisoners to execution sites, and assisting in the operation of gas vans. Absent architects, German commanders and Gestapo officials responsible for organizing these crimes were named during the proceedings, but none were present in the courtroom. Among those charged in absentia were General Richard Ruff, commander of the German 17th Army, Kurt Christmann, commander of Sonderkommando 10A, and 13 members of the SS. Instead, the focus of the trial rested on the collaborators themselves, portrayed as living symbols of betrayal. Though the machinery of occupation had been designed and directed by the Nazi system, it had depended on local participation to function. The tribunal revealed only part of what had taken place in Krasnodar. Testimonies spoke of murdered communists, partisans, Soviet officials, and civilians. Yet Jewish victims, despite clear evidence that they had been singled out for persecution, were largely absent from the official narrative. Civilian suffering was framed as collective Soviet suffering, shaped to reinforce unity in wartime. Verdict and sentence. During the proceedings, the accused admitted their roles in arrests, imprisonment, and killings. Some claimed they had acted out of fear. Others cited ambition or a belief that Germany would ultimately prevail. All pleaded for mercy. On July 17, 1943, the tribunal delivered its verdict. 8 defendants, Vasily Tishchenko, Ivan Rechkalov, Mikhail Lastovina, Nikolai Pushkarev, Grigory Misan, Yunus Napsok, Ivan Kotomtsev, and Ignatiy Kladov, were sentenced to death by hanging. 3 others, Grigory Tuchkov, Vasily Pavlov, and Ivan Paramonov, received 20-year sentences of forced labor within the Gulag system, the network of labor camps where survival was uncertain and conditions were often lethal. Those condemned to imprisonment were transported eastward into a world defined by exhausting labor, hunger, disease, and violence. Public reckoning. The executions of the 8 collaborators took place on the morning of July 18, 1943. Gallows were erected in Krasnodar's central square. An estimated 30,000 people gathered to witness the event, men, women, and children among them. The sentences were read aloud before the condemned were led forward. Some died quickly when the trap doors opened. Others struggled, their bodies trembling as the crowd watched in silence, and in some cases, applause. The executions were photographed and filmed. Reports were circulated throughout the Soviet Union. Though the tribunal did not bring all those responsible to justice, it exposed the methods of German occupation while the war still raged. It demonstrated how mass murder had been organized and how local collaboration had enabled it. The message was unmistakable. Those who aided the enemy would answer for it, publicly and without mercy.